you may be. This is Dean Sanjeev Kakram from the Thunderbird School of Global Management, the #1 ranked school for our Masters in Global Management by the Wall Street Journal, as part of the Arizona State Enterprise, #1 ranked for innovation and #1 for the SDGs in the United States. I want to welcome you to today's Globinar. It's going to be incredibly informative and hopefully inspirational and transformative. We hope that you are healthy and safe, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, wherever you may be. We know these are incredibly trying times, certainly for those of us here in the United States. I think you all see all around the world the tumult that we are witnessing. And given all that has happened over, one may argue, 25 years of impressive, on the one hand, globalization, at the same time where far too many people have been left behind and the anxieties of the future have grown, compounded by a global pandemic that, of course, has transformed all of our lives to live and work from home, to be with our children and our parents full time, to massive unemployment and economic challenges all around the world. But sadly, and most importantly at this point, a sort of wave of exclusionary behavior where nationalisms and populisms are on the rise and try to break us apart and separate us rather than bring us together. For us at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, our vision is a world of sustainable and equitable, inclusive prosperity. And we are committed, and our mission is to empower global leaders and global leadership for the fourth industrial revolution to ensure that we achieve that sustainable and equitable prosperity. The pandemic has only accelerated this transformation that was already underway in the world and laid bare many of the fault lines that have accumulated over 2 or 3 decades of globalization. A major part of that has certainly been about the environment and the natural environment and what's happening in terms of the planet. It just seems just yesterday that I was in Australia with my partner, Diana Bowman, witnessing firsthand and seeing our families being impacted by those horrific fires. And then Rebeca Hwang and Henrik and all of us were at the World Economic Forum at the end of January when the pandemic was really just emerging. And the world was, in some sense, unready for what was to come. Now, we've all adapted with agility and resilience and creativity, everything that we can muster at Thunderbird and ASU. Our principles have been to ensure the safety and health and well-being of all of our students, our faculty, our staff, our community members, our alumni world, our partners, to create and provide and develop, where we don't have them, incredibly rich educational experiences, even in this COVID virtual world, and apropos of these Globinars. But 3, all this to a broader end of bringing the world together, of healing wounds, of ensuring that there is sustainable and equitable prosperity. And so today's discussion, and the title is so powerful, Owls, Lizards, and Dinosaur Feathers, What We Can Learn from Nature to Succeed in I might say, a COVID and a post-COVID-19 era, is so timely and pertinent. So if we could go to the next slide, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. While I do that, please, if you could enter, as Mike was suggesting, your name, affiliation, year if you're a T-Bird or ASU alum, location in the chat. We'd love to know where you're coming from. We have 32 wonderful people joining us from all over the world, and it's great to know who you are and to share with each other so you can be connected. So our first panelist is Rebeca Hwang. She's a professor of practice at Thunderbird and our senior director of the new the Mazrin Global Center for Entrepreneurship and Family Business. She's a founder, entrepreneur, a venture capitalist with over 25 years of experience in startups and startup ecosystems, entrepreneurial ecosystems, as well as her own startups in Europe, the US, and Asia, and Latin America. I'm sorry, we missed that. You can see her incredible resume there, including being a young global leader with the World Economic Forum. Her TED Talk, I would recommend very highly, is truly a powerful and inspirational sort of experience. And most importantly to me is she's such a wonderful friend, a sister, and a wonderful human being. So welcome, Rebecca. We will go to the next slide, please, so I can. Sebastian Campanario, as an economist from the University of Buenos Aires. I just learned that Sebastian and Rebecca were high school mates a long time ago, or maybe not too long ago, let me say, and a journalist. He's been a consultant for CEPAL, PNUD, and the deputy editor for the newspaper Clarín, where he wrote a column, Unusual Economy. He currently published articles in the newspaper La Nación on topics of non-traditional economy, the informal economy, innovation, and creativity. He's written widely and has also done many TED Talks and TEDx Talks. In 2005, he published his first book, The Unusual Economy, which I think has informed certainly the piece that he wrote with Rebecca in 2000, which was re-edited in 2009. And in 2012, he published another turn around the economy. And as you can see, many other incredible accolades. In 2019, he published Senior Revolution, and he's a member of the Baikal Institute. So welcome, Sebastian. We're so grateful that you could join us and be with us. So the premise, and we're going to move straight to the discussion. I want to also, in addition to asking everyone to share where they're from, and I appreciate those who have started to in the chat, we're going to use the Q&A function for your questions and answers. Please go ahead, and if you have a question, ideally put them in the Q&A. It'll be easier for me to then follow and be able to address. And then we'll continue the conversation. So I'm going to ask a few questions to our panelists and to get the discussion going. And then please do jump in, everyone. So the first question, Sebastian and Rebecca, is a sort of a typical question. If it is even appropriate at this time, but maybe share a little bit more before we get into the framing of the article and the argument and the perspective, the inspiration behind it. Why were you inspired to write this article at this time? So maybe I can start with you, Sebastian, and then go over to Rebecca.
Yes, great. Well, thank you very much, Sanjeev, for the invitation. Thank you, Rebecca, and all the people in Thunderbird. As you say, Sanjeev, Rebecca and I were mates in the high school many years ago. And then in the life, we see many times, and me as a journalist, I wrote about Rebecca many times in La Nación and in Clarín. And like a month ago, we were talking in an innovation panel, and we started to talk about non-obvious effects of the pandemic crisis. I mean, I think it's the most interesting thing to talk about, when a ball touches many bands, when you have second, third, fourth, infinite levels of effects. And we started to talk about these metaphors of nature. And I think this is not casual, because we are today in a complex system world, and the natural science are more used to work with complexity than social science. So today we are looking everywhere, many powerful metaphors of nature to describe the situation that it's like a hydra, a monster with many heads. We have the health head, the economic, the social, the politics. So I think complexity is not a new topic, and I'm sure many of you know a lot about it. But in this new world, it's a mindset that has a lot more relevance than before, because everything is so connected that the complexity mindset is much more powerful today to describe and to analyze the things that could happen. And I think that the first thing is that we have to be very, very humble with the predictions and things we can see in many months because of this complexity.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. I'm going to go over to you, Rebecca, and ask you the same question, but let me add another sort of layer to it. I wrote a piece with Nick Davis on punctuated equilibrium, also drawing on sort of complex systems and evolutionary biology. and really talking about, there are times when the systems are in disturbance, and clearly our system is in that state of disturbance. But the belief, the hope, the action is to get it to some new level of equilibrium that hopefully is much higher and better, certainly in terms of the difference, of course, between nature and human systems is the level of consciousness, of human consciousness. And so as you draw this inspiration and also parallel between what we can learn from nature in terms of adapting and being resilient and being successful even in this COVID-19, post-COVID-19 world, how do you see the difference between those natural systems and the human systems because of the level of human consciousness? Rebecca?
Yes, thank you very much. And such a pleasure to be here with you guys this morning. I think, nature has given us a lot of really good examples on how we as systems may adapt and create that flexibility and resilience. We have seen species adopt different types of strategies to both recycle a certain attribute or trait that they already have into a new set of conditions, which the article that Sebastian and I co-wrote mentions as exaptation, where, for example, you may have a species of dinosaurs that had feathers originally to protect their body temperature, but eventually to enable flying. Similarly, you have species like lizards in Australia that, depending on the conditions that they're in, they may lay eggs or give live birth because they want to maximize and optimize the potential results of their reproduction. And this is really interesting from the context of us, human beings, where we are conscious right now that we're going through very dramatic changes, where we know that when we transition back to our new normal, as people are saying, this new environment will be very different from what we're used to, especially when it comes to the workplace. And that truly was one of the inspiration points for Sebastian and myself in rethinking how are we going to define our attributes, our value to the world, our value system that really dominates the way we think about what's important to us, both as businesses and individuals. And that redefinition of identities, both at the organizational and individual levels, was a very intriguing question for us. We know that, in nature, usually there is quite a lot of resilience. We're going to test nature to its extreme now with climate change, and hopefully we'll still be able to rebound. But as human beings as well, we have proven to be quite resilient over the years, but we do face some very unique challenges today, as you mentioned during the beginning of your talk. And so we'd love to, during this conversation, try to identify some of the biggest challenges that we face as we try to cope with the pandemic and racial tensions and financial crisis, and how we may be able to apply some of the tools that we learn from nature to be able to succeed through that process.
That's wonderful. I mean, I think, on the planet side, which you rightfully mentioned, and we've talked so much about, Rebecca, and I know that you've written a lot about, Sebastian, as Kumi Naidu, the former head of Greenpeace and just stepped down from Amnesty International, always would remind me, he'd say, Sanjeev, we humans might go, but the planet will survive. and in terms of, what you said, Sebastian, in terms of social science and, social science is sort of catching up on complexity thinking. It seems to be absolutely true. We have an entire program, and I want to let particularly our Thunderbird and ASU alums know that we've launched a program in Washington, D.C. This is all based on complexity. It starts, in fact, on complex systems, and then really, though, leads into the next question I want to talk to you about, which is, I would say, in fact, the place where we're even further behind outside of, early forerunners like Peter Senge, who talks about systems leadership, and others, is on the leadership and management side. It's actually how to to absorb complexity thinking and systems thinking and be able to let that inform one's behavior as a leader, as a manager, as a professional, as a human being. And so in the article, you talked a lot about reframing our definitions of personal and organizational identity as a result of the COVID-19, and also, reflecting on the analogs or the lessons learned from the environment. Could you to expand a little bit about this? Because as a school that is obviously, as you know, committed to empowering and influencing global leaders and managers to do their work better, and certainly that has changed so dramatically in COVID-19. I think a lot of our audience participants would welcome that type of insight that came from the article and from you and Rebecca. So.
Yeah, yes, it's really very interesting. I think the social science started to develop this topic in the 70s. In 1972, there was a famous article called "More is Different." It's like the original article in social science and physics relationing the society and the network science behind this. And I think in the last 5 to 10 years, the main speaker and writer about this is Nassim Taleb. We all know many things about complexity because of his books, and there are many other famous authors. I think when you start to talk about complexity and management, the first impression is maybe a kind of frustration because you have too many no's, no? Because planification doesn't work, and you can't estimate, you can make futurists, you have at first many no's, but then when you start to study it, you come to find the yes, no? And the yes are that it's more powerful than never to work in teams, the interdisciplinary discussion, of course, with rules, because if not, it's an infinite discussion. As I said before, to be very, very humble with the predictions, to make the right questions, because today you have to make an extra effort to find the perfect question to enable a team and an enterprise and a team in general terms. So I thought I had no sound. So I think that are the main conclusions. With a complex system problem, you can fix it. You have to dance with it. That's the richer metaphor. I'm a fanatic of this topic. In my 5 books, and the 2 books are coming this year. In every book, I write 1 or 2 chapters about complexity, because I think it's a mindset that works for everything. And as I told you before, it's much more important today because of the tougher interconnection of the world. I was reading the other day an article about complexity and health and pandemics. And in the previous pandemics, the SARS virus, it was, I think, like 15 years ago, the world was not that interconnected as today. When this pandemic started in January, in Wuhan, in China, you have 500 international flights per day. That's huge, and this comes to the conclusion I'm talking about, dancing with it. I mean, the complex is not complicated. No, a motor, a car engine is something complicated, but you can fix a part and you fix the whole system. When you touch a part in the complex system, you start to have tipping points and avalanche and all kind of exponentialities, no? And the famous cause of the butterfly movement in China that makes a hurricane in the other side of the world. And today you have that literally. You have a virus that started with a mill in Wuhan, and now you have this global problem. So I think it's a really fascinating topic, and I celebrate that you have a special master or degree in this topic, because I think it will be much more important in the coming years.
Yeah, we have a special one, and in all of our programs, in fact, we have integrated over the last 2 years since I joined complexity thinking, the fourth industrial revolution, new technologies, technological disruption, obviously our historic, I think, very powerful strengths that I know you know, Sebastian, and Rebeca's added to, all of our alums know about a global mindset and understanding, you know, cross-cultural differences. And so, you know, we're very proud of that. And but we still are in our joint inquiry of trying to figure out how to support everyone, from our women entrepreneurs at the bottom of the pyramid to our most senior executives, to be able to dance, as you say, in complex systems. And I'm not surprised, as an Argentinian, thinking of the tango, that you use dance as the metaphor. But I have to say, as a salsa dancer, someone, as Rebeca knows, who loves dance, I very much appreciate that leadership and management, but particularly leadership, is now as much about dancing as it is about orchestrating. We've really shifted in our notions of what leadership means over the years, many years, but certainly with respect to the pandemic and now many other challenges that are sort of, conjuncturally, concomitantly coming together. Rebeca, if I could go back to you, you started to invoke the lizard in Australia as an example of a portfolio approach to mitigating risk. Maybe you could share a little bit more, elaborate a little bit more about that, but also share some of, you started to give some, you teased us with some great analogs from, animal adaptation and, ecosystem adaptation. Keep going there. Share more, and particularly connected to this notion of, leadership and management as dancing in complex systems.
Yes.
As you know, I love music. And so the other, sort of metaphor is that it's jazz, and there's lots of improvisation that is involved now, even more than ever before. So please, Rebeca.
I love this metaphor, and I think there are a lot of parallels to be drawn between dance and different types of dance and the type of uncertainty that we're facing right now. As Sebastian mentioned, what's unique about what we're living through at the moment is that it's very difficult to predict. It's difficult to do a proper scenario analysis and say, look, these are the three outcomes, A, B, and C. The probability for A, B, and C is such and such and such, and therefore we should create solutions to prepare for those three scenarios. We are facing a time where everything could be upside down, or we could go back to somewhat quasi-normal conditions, or we may need to reframe everything around the workspace and physical spaces at work. And let's not even talk about social and financial crisis right now. So when you are in a situation where you don't really know which scenario is more likely, and you may not know for quite a long time, we VCs, venture capitalists, typically approach that lack of certainty and lack of information by creating a portfolio. So when we invest in a portfolio of 20 or 30 companies, we think each one of them is as likely to become a unicorn, and we try to mitigate the risk of putting all of our eggs in one basket by spreading our chips, our money, into a healthy portfolio that exposes us to diversity, to different types of space, industry, sometimes stage even of the company, and also types of founders. And if you ask, an investor at the time of starting the fund, which scenario is more likely, we will say we don't know, and that's why we build the portfolio. That's exactly what we think may need to happen with the crisis, with the pandemic, and how we approach our strategies for innovation and this reframing of the identity that we mentioned before. We may not be able to be prepared for what to come just by saying we're a dancer, right? Just a dancer doesn't prepare us for any potential outcome that we may have in our complexity dancing scenario that Sebastian was mentioning before. We may have to reframe our attributes, but saying, we're really good at following very subtle cues, which is perfect for tango. If some of you have danced tango and salsa merengue, you get a very clear signal, like this is where we're going, right? And they pull you, they push you, and it's a very, very certain move that you have to respond to as a follower, usually in dance, a woman. But in tango, it's a very subtle move. You have a hand on your back, And the move of a finger, like a slight movement of a finger, will tell you left or right, forward or backwards. And when you don't get that right, when you're not paying attention, and when you're not prepared for any of these outcomes, you end up stepping on people's feet. And that's why tango with a beginner is very painful. I can tell you from experience. And I think, that's what we have to do right now. This dance is very subtle. We have to be paying attention to all of the different cues that are extremely subtle. And we have to redefine sort of our attributes, right? In the workforce, if we look at the article, we think of new ways in which we can define our skill sets. So it may no longer be appropriate to say, I'm a program manager or a programmer or a product creator. Those are like saying I'm a dancer. I may need to go further and say, I'm a programmer who really works well from 6 to 8 a.m., who lives alone and can create social distance, who is very comfortable with uncertainty and moving deadlines. It's like saying I'm not just a dancer, but I'm a dancer who can really respond to very subtle moves, and I feel comfortable with tango and not just with salsa and merengue. And that was really fascinating to think about all of the scenarios in which we may now need to redefine what it means to be a member of the workforce. And just to go one step beyond and go back to nature, what was fascinating about this lizard in Australia is that for the first time in history, scientists were able to observe evolution in the making. So you see this lizard that in the past, the same species would either lay eggs or give live birth depending on the environmental conditions to maximize the survival potential of their children. But now this lizard was doing both strategies at the same time in parallel. So it was laying eggs and giving live birth at the same time. And this was basically evolution in the making that hadn't been observed live in the past. And I think that's a great metaphor to what we may need to do as organizations and as individuals in investing in different conformations and different types of repackaging of ourselves that we have to go through to be prepared for very different types of outcomes that may come that we are not able to predict.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I think the metaphor, the analogy of laying eggs and giving live birth at the same time is quite powerful and awesome, and in some sense frightening. But if you combine that with the metaphor of dance and music, and what we always believe at Thunderbird, as you know, and Sebastian, as you now part of our global family, is that in the worst of times, in the most difficult of times, joy helps us as human beings find new ways of adapting and growing to the next stage. So I want to come back to you, Sebastian, and I want to, before I do that, just want to welcome, there's many of you have just joined. We welcome you from around the world. We hope that you're healthy and safe wherever you may be. Please do introduce yourself in the chat function. We have a question from Denis in the Q&A. Please do start our participants join, ask your questions. We'll head to your questions in a short order after a few more. And most importantly, just want to remind you that our sort of theme today is what can we as leaders, as managers, as professionals, as human beings learn from the resilience and adaptation, the complexity and the dance with complexity that we have in the natural world. And so, Sebastian, what are examples of exaptation, as you call it, and as is known, that we may observe in companies or organizations and individuals as we all adapt to this new, COVID-19, post-COVID-19 circumstances? This is very similar to the question that Denny from Indonesia asked. When will, what's the new normal? What will be the new habits, so to speak? I'm a big fan of, of Bourdieu, and when I think about complex systems and the habitus and so forth and so on, will there be a new set of habits that emerge? Or will it be that there will be no habits in some sense?
That's really That's really a great question. First, I want to tell you that I love this metaphor of the dance and the jazz and the tango and the salsa. And I'm a journalist, and I can help myself. And I started to write like a mind map of a probably article, because I really love that that metaphor too. I think it's very useful for today. Well, the title of the article that we wrote with Rebecca, the first animal is an owl. And that's because and a speculation that we started to talk about. It's like maybe in the near future in the office, we will have many shifts. Maybe a third of the company works in the morning, a third in the afternoon, and a third in the night. That's a probable scenario in many cities. And for that, it will be much more efficient to know in advance if your chronotype is a morning type or a night type, or I don't know, Sachin, what's yours? I work much better in the morning and not too good in the night. For example, I was like 10 years at the newspaper Clarín, working mainly at night, and that was terrible for me. And with Rebeca, we talked with a very famous biologist here in Argentina called Diego Galombet, with maybe the best Latin American specialist in chronotype and studies. And he told us that it would be very easy for governments to run massive tests for the people to know exactly when is the perfect time of the day to work. There are many examples. Last Sunday, I was talking with a specialist in complex system and organizations called Azucena Balayan. It's very famous here in Argentina. And for example, she mentioned that a telephone company here, that the part of the people, they self-organize to film short videos to show because they can't go into the homes since the last 2 months. In Argentina, the quarantine is especially very tough here. You can do almost anything. So these people self-organized themselves and started to film short videos to show the customer how to fix internet and telephone, and there was no leader or any boss that told them to do so. So I think we can find a really lots of habits. I don't dance tango. That's very typical in Argentina. You think we all dance. I don't dance, but I'm a fan of chess, for example, and I am a fan of Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov. They were the chess stars when I was an adolescent. And I don't know, Sashim, you follow Garry Kasparov in Twitter. He makes a lot of very interesting comments on innovation. And the other day I was reading a sentence he gave on Twitter that it says that to be good at something, you have to know the rules. To be a real master, a great master, you have to know how to break the rules. I think that's a very good lesson for today. And it's not from the natural world, from chess, but I wanted to share it with you.
It is. It's sort of like, for those of us who are, sort of sci-fi kinds of folks, it's Neo going out of the Matrix, right?
Yeah.
And being able to see the Matrix. And very much it seems that the Matrix is a good metaphor as well. Another metaphor that we could be thinking about life that we currently live in, this world that we live. Rebecca, the other thing, that I've been reading, is a wonderful piece that I'll share with the colleagues here. And you may have seen it, which was basically the most successful, and it was focusing on global business leaders, which is of course a core heart and soul of Thunderbird is training, has trained over the years incredible global business leaders all over the world, and certainly continues to do so. But the ones that are the most successful aren't thinking about the next quarter or the next year or even the next 3 years. They're thinking in century-long timelines. That's the frame that they have. And if you connect that to the systems framework, the complex systems framework, part of the way to lead and manage in complex systems is not to be thinking in the short term, but to expand the time horizon, right? Because then it's a very different dance than one is engaged in. And so as you think about entrepreneurship and innovation, which is your incredible expertise and wisdom, how can entrepreneurs and innovators, global business people, thinking about these long periods of time, start to emulate nature? Because nature, again, doesn't think in just short periods of time. So yes, there are these, bursts of transformation, but what we get drawn to the burst of transformation, and we forget about those periods where lots of things are happening, small, right, perturbations and little things that then lead to the massive transformation. So, I'm combining sort of two thoughts about time in some sense, and sort of thinking about time and complexity, but also then for an entrepreneur, an innovator, who is both by their own identity and their sort of motivation, wanting to, create something new as quickly as possible and scale it and, become a unicorn, let's say. How does now the natural environment and its, our understanding of it help us, and particularly in this complexity of COVID and plus?
Yeah, what a great question. And I think there's one key word to respond to that question. And that word is very timely today in our context, and it's diversity. Why? If you look at nature, the way it has coped really to survive, it has been to create as much diversity as possible in terms of species and conditions, so that you may find the best attributes that over time will make it through adversity, challenges, disruption, and shocks to the system. And it's the same thing for organizations. If we really want to plan for the next 100 years, the one thing you as a leader or manager has to invest in is in diversity, in creating the most complete, holistic, wholesome approach to building a team that is going to be able to apply creativity that only comes when you have a diverse set of perspectives and mindsets at the table. In fact, for complexity, there are books about this. The solutions for complex problems are heavily influenced by the level of diversity that you have in creating those solutions. So even more so, when the complexity of the problem is great, you need to have tremendous amounts of diversity. Now, I also don't want to fall short in saying diversity in the very traditional way that leaders or organizations have framed diversity, which is to have quotas and have one member of each represented at the table. So Rebeca represents a woman, Sebastian represents a man, and then you have the old person, the young person, different religions, sexual orientations, and you have one of each. It's like creating a collection of baseball cards. I don't think that works anymore. I think when you talk about diversity, you have to think about internal diversity as well, because when you have people wearing a certain hat, so if I go to a meeting and my only goal there is to represent the hat of a woman, then I may not naturally draw on my mother and a parent and talk about acceptation, ability to multitask and face uncertainty and noise everywhere when you're trying to make decisions. That's exactly the role of a mother every single day. And believe me that many parents are using acceptation to recycle that attribute now in the times of COVID and post-COVID. But it's very healthy in these discussions when you're really trying to be creative to draw from the 5-6 different hats that you have in your life. So in my case, I'm an educator, I'm an investor, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a mother, I'm a woman, I'm a middle-aged woman now and not so young anymore. And so combining all of these internal diversity features really enables you to come up with the most creative solutions. And imagine having 10, 20 people with the same levels of diversity internally to draw from. And I think that's what I would encourage every leader to think about, not only to invest in diversity, but to reframe the type of diversity and individual diversity that you bring explicitly to the table so that we can maximize and optimize the level of creativity that we have in solving these complex problems. And that's what nature has done. If you look at the species that we talked about in Australia, it was not just a species laying eggs or giving live birth. It was both, and it could do both. And finally, it dared to wear both hats at the same time, instead of saying, I have to be one or the other and choose one of the two conformations. And so that's why I really love that metaphor, because I do believe that it teaches us a lot of lessons on how we may approach our futures in terms of our individual careers, as well as the strategies that we develop as an organization by including this innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship to deal with enormous challenges.
That's incredibly helpful. And we have a question from one of our participants that I'll go to Sebastian for, and then maybe Rebecca, you could also jump in. And I want to invite all of our participants, please do add your questions. If I've missed I don't think I've missed anything in the chat, but into the question and answer function, don't hesitate. This is a wonderful opportunity to share your thoughts and perspectives. So Alexander Keat, our good friend based in New York, working in entrepreneurship and innovation himself, says, it's great for our society to be adapting to change. One might argue that the ability to adapt is a privileged ability, and that underprivileged populations may not be equipped to dance, as they can barely stand as it is. How do we predict global business fluctuations will impact underprivileged populations disproportionately? And how do we create equity to help those populations find their legs to dance in a COVID and post-COVID world? Sebastian, what are your thoughts?
Yes, that's really an interesting question, and I think we can talk many hours about it. For this Sunday, I'm writing an article about inequality and the effects of the pandemic. So I've been reading a lot about it, particularly in the economic field. And that's right. What this alumni said, I completely agree. I think that at the first time on your first question, I talk about these monsters with many heads, this hydra with the health head, the politics, the economics, etc. And I think this hydra is very different in every country. No, there's this famous effect that I think Charit Diamond named it the Anna Karenina effect. I don't know, Charit, if you read Guns, Germs, and Steel, this fantastic book. The Anna Karenina effect. What it says is that in the first sentence of the Tolstoy book, Anna Karenina, says that every happy family is very much alike the other. But the unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. They are very different. And I think in complex systems, this is really happening, because when a part of the chain fails, it leads to many different kinds of problems. So the pandemic problem, and in terms of innovation, it's very different in Argentina, from the States, from Italy, from Uruguay, from many countries. I think that there you have two effects. 2 weeks ago, there was a cover story in The Economist talking about the 90% economy with a much more shrink economy in the future month, and the conclusion of the article that we will have a less innovation in this context, because the serendipity that we have in the office when you talk to the other one in the coffee machine, we don't have it anymore. But I think in the other side that we are having much more connections in this virtual world. I mean, I'm talking to you and Rebecca and the alumni in Thunderbird, and that was maybe unimaginable like 2 months ago. And today we have these network externalities that everybody today, it's very common to have this kind of seminars, and it wasn't very common only 2 months ago. So maybe we have a new field of interconnections and from some innovation that before we didn't know about it.
I want you to pick up on this as well, Rebecca, but we have a question from Nelo for you particularly, and is there also a spiritual solution, or how does spirituality fit in this? And I'm sure, Sebastian, you have some thoughts about this as well. So, Rebecca.
Absolutely. I think we all need that. The other day I went with my kids to the beach for the first time in months, and just connecting with nature at a spiritual level was tremendously healing to me. And I think, many of us truly need that leadership and that practice right now to be able to create moments of introspection, meditation, to truly understand the meaning of all this, right? I mean, there's a phrase that says, "Don't ever waste a crisis," and I do believe that what's happening right now is a wake-up call in many ways. I don't think that this is the last of the disruptions that we will see in our lifetime. Some of the changes that will come will be even more shocking to the system, and this is the time for us to reflect and look into, how all of this changes our framework and understanding of our world. And hopefully, we'll come out of this with a new, commonly agreed value system for our planet, which is hopefully going to contribute to saving it and saving, our ecosystem for our future generations.
Yes, maybe I add something.
Please, I was going to ask you to jump in as well, please.
Yes. Okay, great. I completely agree. As I told you before, Rebecca and I, we met in high school, like many decades ago, and we went together to the Colegio Nacional de Buenos Aires, which is a very good high school here in Buenos Aires, and it's very academic high school and scientific. And then I studied economics, and Rebecca studied engineering and economics. It's a very linear discipline, no? And then, like 10 years ago, I had 3 kids, and the older one is 15 years old now, and he's in the autistic spectrum. My wife is a psychologist, so everything, this academic and scientific, like disappear, and we started to meditate and to make mindfulness and to explore many other answers. And like I enter in a completely new world, and I think those tools are extremely helpful for the today problems. Really, I think that the families with an autistic boy or girl today have a very good set of tools to deal with this kind of problems.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. So as we're reaching our sort of end, I want to go back to this theme that we've been really exploring and advancing, and in some sense doubling and triple down on here at Thunderbird, and that's of compassion. We've had a series of very fascinating discussions and then a globinar on compassion in the global finance sector of all places, and the heightened importance of compassion, not just as a fluffy kind of notion, but something that is at the core in some sense of what it means to be a human being in today's complex system world, adaptive, transforming, shifting so quickly. And it goes back to a question I asked earlier on. While, as you know, Rebecca and Sebastian, I'm a big fan of the analogies and learning from natural systems. Again, that notion of human consciousness, of language and the mediation, the intersubjectivity of human beings, the institutions that we create that can, like the stock market, for example, be so far divorced from underlying natural systems, for good and for ill, because we know stock markets have created immense wealth, not just for a few, but for many in the world, albeit leaving out many and creating lots of downsides. And so I guess I want you to come back to this notion of the limits of the analogies to natural systems, and in some sense, the human consciousness, and the evolution, because that's where I think we also have to spend a lot of time, which is what is the next sets of evolutionary stages in human systems, in human thought, in human capacities, as we have created, in some sense, this human physical world that is completely different from, as we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, pre-first industrial revolution. The world we have today, as you were saying, Sebastian, with 500 flights any particular day, is a very different world than 300 years ago, let alone 1,000 years ago, and so forth. So if you could, sort of come back to humanity and human consciousness. And, you know, I mentioned particularly compassion because it's something that we are very much focused on how to be incredibly effective, resilient, adaptive, agile, all the language that we, you know, leaders, but do that in a human way, in a compassionate way. So Rebecca, I'll go to you and then we'll end up with Sebastian.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting that you mentioned the limitations of this metaphor, and you're right. The limitation is actually caused by the fact that we can be intentional, right? In the changes and the reframing and our strategies, whereas, you know, in nature, things happen without that agency of consciousness. And that has a few consequences. One consequence is that nature is not necessarily against change. If you need a forest fire to clear up the ecosystem to give room for new species or new seasons, that happens naturally, and there doesn't seem to be resistance to that. In human society, we are, you know, almost by definition resistant to change because of all the social systems that have imprinted on us that stability and predictability is a good thing, and therefore sometimes even good change is resisted, and we see this today in the news on a daily basis in the US and around the world. And so I think that is a very important limitation, that because of our consciousness, we are afraid and resistant to change. But at the same time, it could be a very positive attribute of human beings, because when we do decide that change is good, and we decide to be intentional, explicit, and proactive in becoming protagonists of change, then change can happen very quickly. And we have seen this with many social movements around the world. We have seen this with generations that have, you know, at very young age become icons of the future and optimism, you know, like Greta, for example, with all of the environmental work she has done. And so we can use this tool that we have, consciousness, compassion, for the right ways and the wrong way. And I think the right way is to embrace some of these changes and decide that we will be the drivers of it instead of the recipients of it.
Thank
yes,
you. Please, Sebastian.
Yes, I should say. I completely agree that this complex system in nature has a lot of limits to analyze what is happening today with us as human beings. So I tend to mix the complex systems approach and mindset with the behavioral approach. I write a lot about decision theory and behavioral economics. I think that when you mix those two big avenues, you have very clear insights in this debate about the dystopia or utopia in the future, which is, I mean, one of the main tensions today. You previously mentioned Neo and Matrix, and I'm also a fanatic of science fiction. And the other day I was reading about this new term that it's called ambitopia. It's kind of a middle avenue between utopia and dystopia. It means that we live in a very dystopic world today. It's extremely dystopic, but we have signals that they eventually make us turn the, how to say, the volante, the one you use in the car, and find again the good road. I think it's the width. Okay. I think it's a very good metaphor. And also the other day was one of the things I did in this quarantine. I don't know if you, Rebecca and Sachin, do the same. I took all the books of my library and I mixed them and I put them again. And I discovered many books that maybe I read 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or maybe I didn't read a month. Yeah, and one of them was a classic of Viktor Frankl. The title is A Man in Search of the Purpose, talking about compassion, the word you use, Sanjeev. And it's a wonderful book. Maybe many of you have read it, but I think there is one lesson that I wanted to share with you. He talks about the importance of intermediate of average expectations. He said that when he was in Auschwitz, he's a survivor of the concentration camps, the people who was very optimistic didn't get alive because they get frustrated all the time. They think that next week the Ali trophies will liberate them, and that wasn't true. So they didn't survive. And the ones they were very pessimistic didn't survive because this depression. But the people like him who were like average or intermediate expectations were the ones that have the clue to survive to that very extreme situation. So I think today it's a word to have this kind of intermediate expectations. That's a very human ability, because no animals, no flowers, no stones can have them.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, Rebecca. As our alums know, and our partners and prospective students and students who join us for these Globinars, we sometimes are, and consciously so, are very practical. You know, how do you address cash flow issues and things like that in the pandemic? But we go to the very philosophical, and this has been a very important part of our ongoing learning journey. You know, we are co-journeying, as I like to call it, during this pandemic and this complexity. And in some sense, maybe that's going to be the essential part of it. As Archbishop Tutu used to, you know, remind all of us, and certainly, for me, having had the chance of working with him, this notion of Ubuntu, that we are only human to the extent that we are connected to other humans. And in many ways, as you were saying, Sebastian, the way we are doing this has transformed or accelerated dramatically, right, because of the pandemic. But that doesn't mean that the connection is any less important. And that's why we at the Thunderbird School are so committed to continuing to bring the world together, in part by these Globinars, but in every way that we can. I want to thank you again, Sebastian, Rebecca. I want to thank our incredible team, Carlene, Olivia, Sylvia, Mike Grasso, many others that make these possible. I want to thank our participants, alumni, prospective students, all those who join. Please continue to look out for future Globinars. There are many underway. We also have a phenomenal emerging and growing and expanding digital portfolio of executive education opportunities, particularly for our Thunderbird and ASU alums. We have some fantastic scholarships and support to make them more accessible, but more generally for those who want to continue their lifelong learning journey. And for us, that's really what it is. This is education has been disruptive as much as anything else. And this is about a lifelong journey of learning. And if anything has been accelerated and shown as even more critical, is that we have to continue to reinvent ourselves, as Rebecca always reminds me, to have multiple lives and multiple ways of being in this world. So thank you all. Remain safe and healthy. Continue to be the incredible global leaders that you are, bringing the world together. Obviously leading your companies, your organizations, your agencies, your communities, but also doing it with compassion and connectivity. Thank you again, Sebastian, Rebecca. Thank you all. All my best.
Thank you. Bye.